When I was growing up in the 1980s, there were no Thunderbird 2s for me to buy, because for some strange reason that was about the only decade in which Thunderbird 2 has not been available readily on the shelves in the United Kingdom, to the best of my knowledge, because Thunderbirds was at the height of its fame during the 1960s and into the 70s. And although it was still repeated, because I do have childhood memories of seeing it on TV, and it had to be live because there was no streaming in those days, I didn't recall ever seeing any of the toys, and I was into Transformers and Star Wars and so on, all the usual suspects, but no Thunderbirds. But I really enjoyed the series. And in terms of, the future of the past, Thunderbirds was very much the future of the past at that point in time. So it wasn't until many years later, when my own son was being introduced to the series by myself, and he spotted the strings in about 30 seconds flat, then I was sort of wanting to introduce him to it and try and find some toys of it for him to play with. And I came across this very old Thunderbird 2 in a market in Bradford. And it was in remarkably good shape, has a Thunderbird 4 in its pod. And this is actually the first Thunderbird 2 that I ever owned, albeit on my son's behalf. But ironically, very shortly after that, and I didn't know it was coming, came the 2015 animated series, Thunderbirds Go. And of course that brought with it a toy line, which my son preferred over this old antique. And so this was discarded, but I hung on to it, of course, because that's what I do. And he merrily played with his more modern versions. So I was tidying some of his old toys because he's sort of getting out of his toy phase now. And it occurred to me that I had this example, but I also had his modern examples, and I had a few bits in between that I've picked up from sort of retro stores as well along the way. And it occurred to me that this might be one of those very few toys that has kept on being produced generation after generation, because it was produced in the 1960s and the 70s, possibly in Japan in the 80s, but then it was produced in the UK in the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, and, sort of more or less into the current decade, the 2020s. So one way or another, you can buy a Thunderbird 2 at pretty much any point in history for the past 60 years. That's quite impressive. So I thought that I would try and get together the really sort of big examples of it. Although I've got a lot of little examples to show you as well, if you'd like to see them. But I'm going to go through it by manufacturer and just try and sort of take you through my understanding of it, which may well be limited. Hands up, not an expert, but it'll be fun to look at a few of them, I thought. Some of them do have working sounds, some not so much. The ones that don't, I'm going to try and work on to get them up and running for you. But I just thought it'd be an interesting stroll down memory lane for those of you who are old enough to own the originals, and for those of you who, like my son, perhaps got introduced to it by the animated series, which, despite being animated, actually used a lot of physical sets to its credit. Produced by the same company that did Lord of the Rings effects, interestingly, called Weta. So the first section I'm going to get into is Dinky. Now, I've thrown this one in as a bit of a curveball because this is a repainted version of a Dinky Thunderbird 2. I've thrown it in because I picked it up on an eBay auction, and it's an example of why eBay auctions for Thunderbird 2s are so confusing. Because the vast majority of Thunderbird 2 toys are actually really good reproductions of what it looked like in the series. And as a result, unless you have a very clear indication of size for scale in the eBay photo, it's really hard to tell which version of Thunderbird 2 you're looking at, because there have been any number of them in lots of various different sizes. So this is an example of why you've got to look quite closely, because at first glance this looks like quite a modern Thunderbird 2, but it actually isn't. So the details for these are all on the underside of the pod here. You can see it's very clearly marked as Dinky Toys, made in England. This is a relatively, it's not the first edition, because you can see that they have used screws to put the two halves together. And as I understand it, the very earliest Dinky models actually used rivets. Rivets are just, you can't unscrew them basically, they're solid. So this is not one of those, but somebody has repainted an original one. You can see here, one of the differentiators for this particular model is the sort of panelling on the front. Most modern Thunderbird 2s are very smooth on the nose, but this one's got a lot of panelling on the nose there, which does set it apart. Now, unlike again the modern Thunderbird 2s, you have to really sort of just push its pod out. There isn't a quick pod release, and you can see this one still stands very happily on its legs without a pod in it, and this one does not have an example of a door on it. So clearly somebody just got a bit of a sort of a junker model. You see that a lot, that people will get sort of fairly sort of scrappy versions of these and then they'll repaint them. But people are generally pretty upfront in the eBay auctions about whether or not they've done that. So it'll be clear whether or not you're getting one that's been touched up or otherwise has been sort of messed with. But no electronics in this. This one would date from probably in the 70s, this version. But interestingly, Dinky produced this from 67 through to possibly as late as 1980. And it does appear in a lot of my Dinky catalogues that I've done videos on already. So if you want to have a look at it as it was displayed in catalogues, then you can do so on my videos. So whilst the Dinky on the left, the repainted version, is very nice, believe it or not, the one on the right is actually an unpainted original Dinky Thunderbird 2. And yes, it is blue. I do not know why they chose to release it in blue. Dinky often made quite interesting colour choices for their licensed products for no apparent reason, or at least no reason that I'm aware of, other than the fact that I believe I did see a comment once that they felt that children would prefer more colourful models. So when they did the Eagle from Space 1999, they did a green one, even though it was never green in the series, because they thought that would sell better. So I don't know why, but what you get is this rather nice blue, admittedly, but the one on the right is a genuine Dinky Thunderbird 2 that hasn't been touched, and as you can see, slightly sort of scrappy paint-wise, but that is the colour they came in. Very, very early ones, I believe, were green, but they weren't as well detailed as the one on the left, ironically. So the one on the left, that you'll come to see from the other examples, is very much as a Thunderbird 2 should look, with the yellow stripes and so on. So the yellow legs are common in early Dinky Thunderbird 2s, but later ones I believe did have different coloured legs. But if it's a yellow leg, it's fairly early, but not necessarily the earliest. But you can see again on the bottom of the pod here, quite a lot of detail there. So Meccano Limited, which is the company that was behind Dinky Toys. Thunderbird 2, made in England. Now this one does have a Thunderbird 2 in it. Sorry, Thunderbird 2 in it. It has a Thunderbird 4 in it. Having another Thunderbird 2 in it would be clever. Now actually, it looks like somebody might have got a replacement door for that, 'cause I'm pretty sure that door shouldn't look like that. But there is, if I can get it out, this guy. So little Thunderbird 4, and that was the start of a trend which would continue down the decades, because pretty much every Thunderbird 2 does come with a Thunderbird 4 in its pod, which makes perfect sense because in the original series, Thunderbird 4 invariably came from its own pod, but I hadn't noticed that before. That is definitely, I think, a replacement door because it feels plasticky rather than metal. So the other thing to say about these, which may not be immediately apparent, is these are heavy. Even at this size, they are heavy because they are all die cast. They are metal creatures, which is why you will still find so many of these in even sort of little antique stores around the country. You will still find many Dinky Thunderbird 2s. because you know they will survive because they are very, very hard to destroy. It's that simple, really. Because being all metal, this is what happens. You'll find I can't quite get its pod back in now, but anyway, you will find examples undoubtedly where legs are missing, but often on eBay you will find people who are 3D printing legs, for example. So I may possibly be able to get hold of a really original Thunderbird 2, but those are two really nice examples, and I've not seen a repainted one like the one on the left done so well ever. So I just thought I'd grab that whilst it was available. So come 1980, these were the only Thunderbird 2s that had been sort of produced in the UK that I'm aware of, but Japan loved Thunderbirds, it seems. So Japan were producing a lot of plastic kits, I believe, around this sort of time. They may even have been producing their own versions domestically, I don't know for sure. But during the 1980s, there was this gap. So I'm going to take you about 10 years forward in time and show you the Matchbox versions. Now, as you can see, Matchbox decided to take Go Big or Go Home pretty literally, because their first big plastic electronic, as I've seen it called on eBay, supersize Thunderbird 2 was a bit of a beast as compared to the original dinky version that you can see nestling next to it. It's 40 centimetres or 16 inches long, so in old money nearly 1.5 feet. It's huge, but it's incredibly solid. And this one comes from 1992, so she is 30 years old plus now at the time of filming, and she is still in remarkably good condition with really good solid plastic. Nothing wrong with her at all, apart from the fact that her sounds do not work. But the buttons at the back here are a really good way of telling her apart from other electronic Thunderbird 2s that have bigger buttons. So if you see a big electronic Thunderbird 2 on eBay, they'll all look very similar because they'll all have yellow stripes on the wingtips and they'll have this yellow stripe across there. Thunderbird 2 red intakes. But you notice the intake colour is kind of inside the intake properly on this one. They will all look and have these sorts of characteristics, but the buttons vary quite a bit, so it's a useful way to tell them apart. Now, they will also tend to do this sort of thing. So as you can see, the legs will flip out quite happily using the side buttons, and they should stand quite happily like that. They will also tend to do this sort of thing, and there's a button towards the top of the cockpit that I'm pulling back. Crunch. Out drops the pod. So again, with these I mean, even with the smaller dinky one, of course, the pod being able to come down is pretty standard for Thunderbird 2s. So let me just lift the mothership out of the way. I'll pop it down there. Also, the windows can change quite a bit. So again, the windows may be a way of telling, and there's like a square with a 2 on the middle of it in there as well. And as I mentioned, this is smooth on this version. The sort of the roof of the cockpit is smooth, so it's not like the dinky where there was more paneling. But as you can see here, the same button that allows you to drop the pod, and this pod has a 4 on the front of it, also allows you to open the pod door. And this is what the Thunderbird 4 for this version of Thunderbird 2 looks like. It doesn't do a huge amount, it's pretty much a solid lump of plastic, but Thunderbird 4 there, 4 on the fin, that's traditional old school classic Thunderbird 4, and it has the bulldozer sort of attachment. It's also got little missile things that sort of don't go anywhere but just pop out there, which I think is probably completely normal. But again, nice to get. You don't always get Thunderbird 4s with Thunderbird 2s on eBay auctions. You must check that the pictures have got one or that they say that it's got one, because almost certainly many of them will have them missing. I can't say that I've ever searched for Thunderbird 4s separately, but it's probably relatively unusual to find them separate, I would imagine. But because, you know, if they're not with the mothership, the odds are they probably went and are lost in the mists of time or a landfill somewhere. So that is supersize 1992 Matchbox Thunderbird 2. Do make sure that they've tested the electronics. As I say, this one doesn't work. This one I just picked up randomly in the market. I'll show you the back as well. Now, I don't know whether they ever have stickers on the back. Some of the later ones do. This one obviously has red sort of aft intakes there, and it's got the engine decorations there. So again, these are the sorts of little details that vary between different models, but generally speaking the paint jobs will be fairly uniform, although again there will be differences. So there was also a smaller version of this done by Matchbox, which is this fellow. Now, again, red legs here, grey legs on the big model, red legs on the smaller model. But you'll see that this one shares a lot of similarities but isn't identical to the Dinky. And I'm going to move the Dinky out of the way now so there's no confusion. But you can see that the Dinky repaint that I showed you earlier is very, very similar to this one, which is kind of what you'd expect. This is very much die cast. This is a very heavy model for its size. It's got red buttons on either side to drop the legs, but it's also got this little red button at the back which the Dinky lacks, and that drops its pod. So again, we've sort of upgraded a little bit. Now you can see that's a proper door with a 4 on it, and inside here we also have a Thunderbird 4, or we would have if I hadn't left it behind. So this is its little Thunderbird 4, and as you can see it's actually hollow. It's not completely solid, this one, but this is, it does have a little bulldozer effect that you can see there, and it's metal, so it's again, it's solid, but it is hollow on the inside, and that's a good differentiator for this particular type of Thunderbird 4. And it definitely is this one, because it will fit back in its pod, like so, and quite happily sit in there. So you can see why these Thunderbird 4s are so easy to lose, because they are very, very small creatures which will disappear at a moment's notice. But I have been quite fortunate that I've got examples of Thunderbird 2s that have managed to hold on to them, which is no mean feat. So I'll show you this a little bit closer up. So again, you can see that in an eBay photo, this looks very, very similar to the larger versions. And you can see a little bit of differentiation there because it's got sort of green studs at the back and it's got the red legs. But actually, the detail level, this is also a puzzling feature of them, because they have these sort of 4 squares on the back, but most of them do, which doesn't really help you in terms of telling them apart. But you'll notice that there's a square here, but the 2 is actually ahead of the square. So that's a little bit different as compared to the big model where the 2 is in the square, but hopefully the descriptions will be as they should be. But I have seen these priced at about the same as I'd expect to pay for the big Thunderbird 2, because at the time of recording, I would expect to pay probably about £30 at the most for a big supersized Thunderbird 2. So if you see a small one priced like that, maybe shop around a bit more. So those were the Matchbox Thunderbird 2s from the very early 90s. I do have one more thing to show you actually. But this is the figure that goes inside the large Thunderbird 2, and in fact I have neglected an element of this Thunderbird 2's playability, which I can only apologise for. If you drop the pod, you can then open up the cockpit. Now, as I look at this cockpit now, I'm actually wondering whether this version example that I got is lacking in decals and stickers. But to be honest, I haven't checked that point. So if you know whether it should have stickers, do let me know in the comments. I know the later versions should have stickers, but he was designed to just lie down there. So Virgil can quite happily pilot Thunderbird 2. And this causes a big dilemma with these models, because in order to get action figures into them, they would have to be huge to accommodate really big action figures. So what they've done here is compromise, because obviously that's not in scale with Thunderbird 2 in the series. The cockpit is much bigger in the series as compared to a human figure. And we'll see when we look at other examples that other ranges have taken different approaches to that. But with this Matchbox range, you get quite big figures because you can only get 2 in the cockpit. So that's it for Matchbox, and we'll now jump ahead quite a few years again to the apparently 1999, that sort of mark, and that is when Vivid will come on the scene. Now, as you can see, this is where things get interesting. On the right hand side, you have the supersized Matchbox Thunderbird 2. On the left hand side, you have the Carlton 1999 Thunderbird 2. Also, I believe, produced by Vivid. And Vivid will return again, but Vivid were actually developed from Matchbox, in the sense that somebody from Matchbox went to Vivid and created Vivid, set Vivid up. And they then have become a major force in toy manufacturing ever since. But in '92, Vivid were only producing Captain Scarlet. They hadn't gone into Thunderbirds, but now, in '99, they have. But they weren't obvious unless you looked on the box. And they were producing what they termed Sound Tech Thunderbird vehicles. And as you can see, the most immediate difference is the colour scheme. The actual shapes are slightly different as well, but the colour scheme is the most noticeable difference. So there's a much deeper, darker green on the Carlton version of the supersized Thunderbird 2. Legs are not a dissimilar colour. Obviously the markings are nigh on identical, but you'll see that there is no pod release here on the Carlton. The Carlton's pod release is actually back here at the back. So the Carlton looks like it has 3 buttons at the back, but actually these are sound buttons on either side.
Let's get to work.
I'm hoping that's going to stop at some point. So the Matchbox would have done something similar as well, of course, because as I've mentioned, my Matchbox's sounds aren't working. Now, I believe that a bone of contention with this Carlton one and its accuracy are things like this. You can see here that the red intake is actually a sticker, and then it's got a more sort of vented intake here. Whereas on the Matchbox version, the intake red is kind of indented into the Thunderbird, and it's shaped rather differently. And this does, to my naked eye, that somehow looks wrong. I prefer that version of it where it's sort of indented into the actual infrastructure of the ship. So I'm guessing that might be, what some people sort of point out as it being not quite such a nice version. I'm also not entirely convinced about the pointedness of this nose. I don't think Thunderbird 2 had quite such a pointy nose, but you'll see that 6 windows on both of them. Looks very nearly the same size. The Carlton's just basically is a sort of a nose longer than the Matchbox version. Both have a rectangle up here, but again the 2 on the Carlton is lower down than the 2 in the Matchbox, which comes inside the rectangle. The Thunderbird 2 name here on the Carlton is lower down than it is on the Matchbox and further forward. The yellow marking across the top is the same, but this has pop down leg buttons on the top side here, whereas on the Matchbox they're just behind the wings. I'm going to take the Matchbox away now just so I can take you through some more detail on the Carlton version. I mean, hopefully this isn't going to need its own bit of international rescue as I put it down. Right, so The nice bit of detailing here is on the engines. So you get these double black lines there, and I had to hunt around for one that still had these yellow stickers intact, but these yellow circular stickers on the back are also indicative of the Carlton. Another difference between this one and the Matchbox is that this just has green all the way along the sort of the topmost intakes there, whereas the Matchbox has white. But other than that, those are probably the primary differences. I'll put the pod out. In fact, there is another difference, and I'll show you this one now because this is one of the most obvious ones. If you lift this up, you don't have to bring the pod down first, he says. Of course, I won't be able to do it now, having said that. I literally only just got this one today. I wasn't even sure how long it was going to take, but it has arrived in remarkably good time. Now, this is what's nice about this. It's got stickers on the inside, and as you can see, Carlton went for a different approach, and it was quite a brave approach because this is the size of the minifigures that this ship comes with. And as you can see, you know, it's only twice the size of my thumbnail, so it is absolutely tiny compared to the approach that Matchbox took with figures lying down. But he can actually tuck his little feet underneath the console there and sit in the seat like that. Now that's really, really clever because that's far more on a scale with the series. And I also managed to get a version of this that had the stickers here. You see quite a few of them on eBay auctions that do not have all these stickers around. So it was nice to get one that was fully complete in this sense. So the fact that you can actually get a Virgil in there is really impressive. And I mean, you know, who knows how many of those are actually left these days because they are so small. They are incredibly small. So as I say, I think it was very, very brave of me to even attempt to do them at that sort of scale. But it does mean that you get figures that are in scale with the Thunderbird 2 model, which is very, very good. And you also, and as I mentioned, you don't need to put this pod down before you can open the cockpit either, which is also very clever. So this middle button is not a sound button. This is what deploys the pod on this version, he says. Crunch. It's always best to have something soft underneath it. However, you can see as well that this, unlike the Matchbox version, is a little bit different. So this version of Thunderbird 4 is probably about the same size as the Thunderbird 4, but if you look in the window, you might just be able to make out that in fact there is a figure inside the Thunderbird 4 because the Thunderbird 4 has a proper cockpit. I don't think there are any other Thunderbird 4 examples I can think of that have opening cockpits to get a figure in and also fit inside Thunderbird 2. So again, really brave choice on their part. And this little guy, this Gordon, has actually got a little visor on his helmet. So he's actually got a little sort of swimming sort of helmet that you can lift up and put back down again. And again, I have very, very rarely seen those on eBay in the time that I've been looking at eBay. And again, we've got stickers here, stickers on the console. So I thought this was a really, really nice example of it. And I went for this one above others that would have been a bit cheaper because, you know, in order to give you a full idea of what a complete one looks like, I decided to be somewhat patient. So in terms of the ordering of this video, although this is right in the middle, it's actually being filmed last because I got this last. But it did come very, very promptly, happily, so I haven't had to wait too long. And as you can see, this the pod is very mobile, so the wheels on the bottom of this one are really good. So if I were to pick a favourite, I would say that this is probably right up there because in terms of the sort of the overall level of detail and the sort of sheer bravery of the size of the figures that they chose to do with it, and the electronics as well, obviously are good and exist, which is a bonus. So, you know, I like the colour of it as well. I'm not entirely sure if it's so accurate, to be honest, but I think it's a really nice dark green, and it probably forgives scrapes and sort of play wear perhaps more than other things would. So, as with Matchbox, Carlton also produced a small version. Their small version is actually, I'll compare it with the, I was saying I'm going to compare it with the Matchbox version. I can do actually, yes. So this is Matchbox. I'll put that one on the right as I did originally there. And this is Carlton. And as you can see, very, very similar, but the Carlton is longer, quite substantially, 3-4 centimetres longer than the Matchbox original version. But again, similarly, nice positive flip down legs, dark grey legs on this one, but exactly the same layout. So again, pod deploys from there without difficulty. And again, a little Thunderbird 4 in there. This one is fully plastic, but it does include a little sort of bulldozer element on the front. And I'm hoping that is its Thunderbird 4, and I haven't inadvertently put the wrong one in, but there isn't a great deal of, that might say, does that say Carlton? I actually can't quite make that out even with my glasses on, sadly. That's age for you, but it is possible that is actually a Carlton one. You might be able to see that if it focuses in a bit, but there is a little bit of writing on there. Actually, yes, I can see Carlton on that, so that is the right one. So, again, you should get, in theory, a Thunderbird 4. Carlton don't seem to like putting 4 on the pod door, which is a bit of a shame. It's the one thing that they don't tend to do. But it's, again, it's a good example because it is that little bit chunkier. It is, however, light as a feather. So it isn't as metal at all. In fact, there is no metal apart from screws holding it together. That's plastic. So it isn't going to last as well as the Matchbox version, which is metal. However, you also get, so its batteries are somewhat dying, I think, but it does make sound effects. And again, this is the sound tech features of the Carlton range and the Vivid range. So, again, Carlton was sort of very much all in. So this was coming into the 2000s. Carlton definitely were trying hard. I'm not sure if it was sort of an anniversary release. I don't think it would have particularly fit with any of the anniversaries of the show. But perhaps because they knew that a new modern film was coming, they felt they should try it. So those are all of the sort of the classic Thunderbirds. I am going to show you a Corgi version as well a little bit later on. But now we have to get into the slightly prickly field of the 2004 movie. Just before I show you the controversial, slightly, 2004 Thunderbird 2, just thought I'd show you this other little play feature that I've neglected on this Thunderbird 2, which is it's got this little pull-down winch here, which basically you can attach the little action figures to as well, and then they can sort of pull things up using that winch, and which none of the other Thunderbird 2s have. So as I say, Carlton were doing really, really well. And after Carlton, we had Bandai, rather unusually. So the only sort of non-British company to actually have a crack at an official Thunderbird 2 license. I mean, other non-British companies have done it, but in terms of one that was sort of on, mainstream toy shelves, if you like, in the UK. And this is it. Now, as you can see, this is as supersized as the 2004 film Thunderbird 2 got. They released several versions which we're just about to look at, but this is the biggest one that they did. And it does contain electronics, but as you can see, it falls well short, size-wise, of the Carlton version. So they did not go anywhere near as big for this one. And its pod system is very different. As you can see, the green is slightly more interesting than the Carlton version and indeed the Matchbox version. So when you look at them alongside each other, you can see that it inherits certain things from the traditional Thunderbird 2, but it is nevertheless simultaneously a very, very different beast. And it's here just for sort of size comparison purposes, obviously, because we're really shifting into a slightly different era now. Once we get past the 2000 mark, we only see one more example of the traditional Thunderbird 2 that I have here with me. Other companies do keep on producing it, and in particular Japanese companies do keep on producing it actually, but here in the UK there's only one more example that I'm aware of where it's produced in a sort of normal off-the-shelf purchasable sort of version. So I will now move into the rather interesting range of movie Thunderbird 2s. Now, this might be a bit controversial because this, of course, is the somewhat infamous Thunderbird 2 version from 2004. Now, I say it's infamous. I think the film is, it's fair to say, generally not well regarded. Helmed by Jonathan Frakes of Star Trek Next Generation, Commander Riker fame, of course. But unfortunately, it seems that they didn't quite get hold of Thunderbirds as a concept. But what we did get out of it is this Bandai range of merchandise on behalf of VTC. I'm just going to find the details here because there we go. So it was Bandai 2004. It's for ITC Entertainment, but I think it's a VCT or something Venture is the actual company that seems to have been responsible for actually sort of launching it as such, you know, in terms of the actual sort of toy line and the spin-off stuff. But to be honest, it's the actual toy itself. I've literally only had it today because I didn't have this. This is another eBay pickup. But it's not that bad. They didn't have a detachable pod in this version of it, so the pod system is rather different. So we have these are sort of slightly concealed buttons up top, but if you press this one, whoops, that's another issue I have with this one. I'll show you this in a moment. But there is yeah. So that pod deploys from the front, but it's kind of locked in. I think they probably will come out, but I don't want to mess with it too much. But basically, it's kind of inbuilt. It just drops down. So the landing legs come down, and this pod drops down. So it's kind of odd like that, to my way of thinking anyway. And then you've got two more pods that come down from the bottom there as well. So altogether you've got three pods built into the bottom of the Thunderbird 2. So, you know, okay, get that. Now, I haven't actually tried its legs yet, but I think the legs are somewhat unusual because they seem to, like, they're going to come straight down. I don't know if I need... Okay. So you literally just press that and then the little leg drops down, which means that's not long enough to... Oh yes, there we go. So it telescopes a little bit. So it telescopes just enough that you can probably get your pod vehicles out. But you've really got to sort of manually pull them out, which is odd. So you've got these stubby little legs. Now, is that actually going to support it? Yeah, okay. Right, fair dues. No, it does kind of support it. My biggest worry with this ship, because I noticed this in a couple of the eBay auctions I was looking at for it, my biggest issue with it is this. Can you see that? Can you see that? That bends. It bends really badly. And I don't think it's probably not just mine. They obviously felt they wanted to put a curve on it to make it look like a sexy futuristic Thunderbird 2. But unfortunately, the plastic is so thin at the back there, unlike the old school Thunderbird 2s, that it makes it a real design issue because you can't hold it comfortably I would not want to hold the whole of that ship, even though it's not that heavy. You wouldn't. I mean, yeah, okay, you can, but I wouldn't want to fly it like that. Not really. So turn it on at the back, and it has got light up engines. Now, is that it? Is that all you're going to do? Somebody sent it in the post with batteries still in it, by the way. You're not supposed to do that. So if you hold it down, you get maximum thrust. Okay. That's interesting. I did not know that. That was complete fluke. It was purely because I was wondering whether or not it did any more sound effects, but it would seem that is the only sound effect that it does do. So, yeah, it lacks some of the character. You can see they've sort of red intakes there. There's some echoes. There's a there's a 2 there. Thunderbird 2's there. So it's kind of echoing the original, but it just isn't, is it? It just isn't the same. Yeah. Now, in its defence, what I will say, and I had to hunt hard to get these, but it does come with 3 mini vehicles. So you do get a Thunderbird 4, a Mole, and a Firefly in the packaging that it comes in. But I'll tell you what else is hard with this one, especially if you're looking for it on eBay. The sheer number of variants of this one is crazy, and I'll show you. So we have this one. Now this is the deluxe version. That's officially called the deluxe version. Then you get this one, which, as you can see, is so popular it's still in its packaging. Now this one is exactly the same. I would say that the Thunderbird 4 is probably identical to the one I just showed you, but this is the DX version. You see here, the DX vehicle, and it's 15 centimetres. That is often what people call it on eBay, but as you can see, it isn't actually the biggest version of it. I would say it's half the size of the biggest version, but it's weird because it's Bandai. I think they're using sort of Japanese naming standards for it, so that's why this is called. Oh, sorry, this also comes with a mole as well. This has also got a mole just there. Can you see? Sorry, it's not focusing in very well because my finger's in the way, but there is also a mole lurking in the corner there. So you do get 2 mini vehicles with this one as well, in fairness to them. But this is the sort of mid-range one. But then they don't stop there. It just keeps coming, because then you get this one, which I got in this job lot, which again has got part of the Thunderbird 5 space station with it, and has a slightly different sort of pod effect system. But again, this is just getting teeny tiny now. So that's a sort of that's an 8 centimetre action vehicle, and again, obviously fresh in box, minty in box. But then once upon a time, I also picked up this one randomly, and I don't think that isn't the same as the one that's in that box, because this is actually more of a sort of pullback one. Thunderbirds are gone, apparently. So there you go. So that's another little one. And then another job lot I picked up, I got this little one, which looks like it's had sort of a sort of tortoise shell effect slapped on the top of it. And again, I don't even know what that... I mean, it's got wheels, but that's about all I can tell you about it. And again, it's got the sort of VTC entertainment bit, but you can VT Venture or something. But you can see that they push the merchandising for this to the limits. I think that does constitute the sum total of all the bits that I've got for it. I will just sneak in a cheeky Thunderbird 1 shot there as well. That comes with Lady Penelope's Rolls Royce there as well, or whatever that version of it was. So again, they did do the other vehicles, and I've got a few examples of those. So I could, in theory, do a video on those at some point. But again, it's all a little bit excessive. I mean, when you consider that normally you get one big Thunderbird 2 and a little Thunderbird 2, and here we've got 5 in front of us of varying sizes. So it does seem a little bit heavy-handed of them. But, and obviously we've got all these mini vehicles, some of which might be repeats, but I'm kind of tempted to leave them in the packaging for now, because it might have a renaissance, you never know, and if you were a completist, then you could say that you had them, but, it's not really, it's proper Thunderbirds, but it's not, so, I don't think the die-hard Gerry Anderson fans would really consider it to be part of the pantheon, but I include it for reference and for the avoidance of confusion should you be trying to get a Thunderbird 2 and you see one of these and you wonder what's going on. That's why it's a film tie-in. They tried to do the cash-in thing. It probably didn't work very well. And it's one of the few times where a more sort of foreign firm has actually manufactured Thunderbirds, I think. At least in terms of the ones that we then end up with in this country. So that's it for the 2004 film version. So here's a little test for you. These Thunderbirds obviously look very, very similar. However, there is a substantial time gap between them both. And the reason is that the one on the right is actually produced by Corgi. And it was produced by Corgi, I believe, during the 2000s and the 2010s when it was re-released. And that's, I think, is when we picked it up, my son and I, as part of a set which included, I think it was Thunderbird. I was going to say 1, then I changed my mind and thought it was 3. But in any event, it was a sort of a double pack release that Corgi did. And the funny thing was that Corgi up to this point had never actually released any Thunderbirds toys. Corgi did a lot of licensing back in the 70s and 80s, but they never covered Thunderbirds because Dinky always had the Thunderbirds license. But Matchbox had, of course, had the Thunderbirds license from 1992, as we've already covered. And interestingly, you'll see that these two are very, very similar. And there was an interesting fact in that the Matchbox designer actually founded Vivid, but strangely, of course, the one on the right isn't Vivid. So I wonder if Corgi actually got hold of the original Matchbox casts, because they're both very metal, and as you can see, they both have like the same little round buttons to bring the legs down. They've both got the pod release at the back. Their twos are in the same place. The windows are slightly different on the Corgi, and this is the Corgi with the grey buttons. So it actually sets itself apart from all the other smaller Thunderbird 2s that I've looked at, because they all tend to have red buttons. But the Corgi unusually has grey, so that's a good way to tell it apart. As you can see, the paint scheme is substantially darker green than the Matchbox. But apart from a few detailing changes, so for example, there are some detail lines here and a square at the back, which the Corgi doesn't have. They are very, very similar size-wise, inevitably similar mould-wise, because obviously they're both Thunderbird 2s, but the sizing is so spot on to each other. Even if you look at the back, you'll see that the exhaust designs are also very, very similar, although the Corgi gets extra points because it has the yellow banding on the end of the exhaust there, but the actual approach to the exhaust with having these little sort of green nubs at the back there is also very, very similar. So I do wonder whether or not Corgi actually managed to inherit the Matchbox moulds in some way, shape or form, because that does seem likely looking at these two, because they are very, very similar. But you know, the Corgi is a nice modern version of it, and it, as I say, because it is very, very similar to the Matchbox. Ironically, that doesn't seem to want to come out for me. Let's try that again. There we go. So as usual, pod there with the door, and the the Corgi Thunderbird 4 is solid metal. Pops in there very happily and shut up shop. And then obviously just pops back in. Whoops. Oh dear. Well, it's possibly slightly less minty than it was before, but fortunately being metal, it's actually survived the impact of the floor. I guess if I had a bloopers reel, that would be in the bloopers reel, but anyway. So clearly some care required with this particular pod, and perhaps put it in with it facing upwards to try and avoid that sort of thing happening. I haven't really mentioned the rollers up until this point, but virtually all of these Thunderbird 2s do have rollers on the bottom of the pod, which enables the Thunderbird 2 as a toy just to sort of, you know, move along the ground, which emulates how it got out of the hangar and onto its launch ramp in the series. So, you know, they all have some sort of ground mobility to them, virtually bar none. In fact, even the smaller ones will generally have wheels. But I just thought it would be interesting to compare those two alongside one another. And again, if you see a Corgi Thunderbird 2 being advertised on eBay, it will only be the small one. They did not do a bigger version, so there isn't a supersized one that I'm aware of, and I really don't think one was ever produced by Corgi. But it is just interesting because it means that in the end, you have Dinky and Matchbox and Corgi all having produced it, or at very strange times. So you would have expected Corgi to have produced it in the sort of the 80s gap, perhaps, but they never did. No idea why not, but they just didn't. So it's all sort of lends to the history of it, I guess, that Corgi of late have they've also re-released the things like Moonraker. Their Moonraker model they've reissued as well, so that they're obviously doing a lot of reissues at the moment as part and parcel of their sort of current lines. So every now and again you will see them produce stuff that hasn't been around for a while. So the next one I'm going to move on to is the big animated series Modern Thunderbird 2. So here we have the film version from 2004 of Thunderbird 2 as against the animated version of Thunderbird 2 from the 2015 Thunderbirds Are Go series. And as you can probably immediately tell, the Thunderbird 2 from the animated series is a bit of a beast because it is substantially larger than the biggest version of Thunderbird 2 from the film. So I'm going to take the film Thunderbird 2 away now. But you've had it there for comparison purposes. And let's focus on the Thunderbirds Are Go one. And I have to say, I really, really enjoyed this series, and I watched a lot of it with my son, so it does bring back very fond memories for me. But as you can see, they put a lot of effort into this. This actually gathered a bit of dust over time, bless him. But you can see that they've changed the overall layout. Perhaps if I put one of the earlier Thunderbird 2, this is actually another random one. I haven't actually looked at this closely to see who it's made by, but this is just a little one I got in a little job lot. But you can see that the wings are it's designed very much to evoke the original Thunderbird 2, but the wings are rather different. The wings can fold up to make it more compact. It doesn't have quite such a sort of an arch over the back of the body. It's a much flatter sort of lifting body kind of approach. Windows on the front are slightly different, but there are still the intakes there. There's still the yellow line across the front, but now there's a yellow line at the back of the pod as well, and it retains the pod approach. But interestingly, there's a spin on it because the pods actually contain modular pods themselves. In fact, I think they're called modules now in this series. So they can actually create modular vehicles, adaptable vehicles inside Thunderbird 2 to suit whatever danger zone they're going to. So it's quite a clever approach to things. The cockpit opens initially there because the series has this sort of top hatch through which Virgil sometimes enters, but it also does do the lifting up bit, and I applied these countless stickers because this is the household owned Thunderbird 2, one of the very few that I didn't have to buy in. And there were shed loads of stickers, but the stickers are good. There are little control levers here. Now, the really interesting thing about this one is that I can't remember seeing really small figures for it. So I'm not sure that they went that way with this line. What they did do was have these really big figures. So this is Scott, and he's got a rather sort of cool jetpacky thing on. But as you can see, he does not in any way, shape or form fit inside that cockpit. Nor should he, because it's not his cockpit, obviously. But nevertheless, he does not fit inside that cockpit. And I have had a quick look around and I cannot see any smaller modern figures that fit inside that cockpit. So I'm not quite sure whether or not I'm missing them or if they just decided that they weren't going to go that way with this particular model of big Thunderbird 2. So that maybe that this is where the modern series has actually chosen to depart. And the interesting thing about this is it was distributed and created by Vivid. And you may remember that Vivid also did the Carlton era of Thunderbird 2s. So it's really fascinating in a sense because it's kind of come full circle, because when Vivid first started out, Matchbox was still doing the Thunderbirds range. Vivid started doing the Captain Scarlet toys at the same time as Matchbox were releasing their 1992 Thunderbirds. But ultimately, Vivid have ended up coming round to do Thunderbirds, and they are the ones who are marketing this. So I haven't got the sound effects working on this one, but I can show you some sound effects on the smaller one in a second. So standard pod release system, press at the back. But again, just like the other Thunderbirds, big size ones, you also get the landing legs that can come out like that. And I can't actually remember immediately how you flick them out. It may be, is it that? Nope. But they've also got these landing thrusters as well, which is something different to because this Thunderbird 2 had variable geometry landing jets, somewhat different to the original series Thunderbird 2, but makes perfect sense. And this is what was clever about this series. You know, they took their physics and their representation of physics pretty seriously. I mean, yes, it had a lot of sort of, you know, higher tech kind of spin on it, certainly, but nevertheless, they were trying pretty hard with it, which is one of the things that I appreciated about it. And the fact that they went for practical effects on top of CGI effects, I thought did them a lot of credit. Now, this again has a rather sort of spacious Thunderbird 4 pod. And Thunderbird 4 was one of the things that could be loaded into the pods. So in theory, you can make it pop out, but I don't think I've quite got the knack for it. There is a sort of paddle effect on the back of the pod, but this, as you'll see, is a rather different style of Thunderbird 4 as compared with the older version of Thunderbird 4. And again, it had, I think it has sort of deployable arms and things as well, but they've gone for a fairly sort of straightforward plasticky version of it for the pod version. I also have this version. Now, I think this is, yes, it's Tomica. And I originally thought that this was perhaps a replacement for the small Thunderbird 2, Thunderbird 4, but it isn't. So again, always popular in Japan, and they seem to have released this as an add-on for the Thunderbirds Argo series. So it's a really nice die-cast model. And I'd be quite tempted to hunt down others of this type, because that's a really lovely little toy. You know, it's exactly the sort of toy I would have loved when I was little. But nice example of that. So you could also buy a pack of pod vehicles, which would you know, allow you to do the sort of the modular pod construction bits. And we have still got that somewhere actually, but because I'm focusing in on the Thunderbird 2 aspect of it, I haven't bothered fishing this out. But features sound effects, as I mentioned, but I actually haven't got them operational at the minute. it'll only need new batteries. But you can see again, sort of these intakes are very similar to the original Thunderbird 2 intakes, but it's much more rectangular along here. There's a sort of they've just sort of squared it off that little bit more to distinguish it. But again, at the back here, that's not dissimilar. A bit wider in the body overall, isn't it? It's flatter than the original Thunderbird 2. Slightly different engine configuration, but essentially they're exactly the same aircraft. That's the thing, exactly the same principle. Whereas the movie version took a slightly different spin on it, and this one kind of returns very much to its roots. And it's you got to hand it to them. I mean, the first episode featured part of a Space 1999 Eagle and a little clip of Stingray. So they were in no way distancing themselves from the original series. Quite the opposite. It was intended to be a proper sort of homage. But they found their own way of doing it as well, which I think was really impressive. Now, this is Little Thunderbird 2, and as you can see, it's very much the same. If I size it up against the old school Matchbox Thunderbird 2, there's actually that little bit bigger. Not by much, but it's a little bit bigger, so there's a little bit more to it again. And that's not a bad way to compare them either, actually, with them both in shot like that. So you can see that the original Thunderbird 2 was just a little bit taller, but narrower at the back, whereas this one's just that sort of that bit broader. But and sort of more rounded off at the front, more obvious air intakes at the front. But essentially, you would see it and think, yes, that's Thunderbird 2. So it's clever because it's an update that doesn't lose anything. So sound effects here.
Copy that, Thunderbird 4. Thunderbird 2 is go. Copy that, Thunderbird 4.
So it's just a little selection, but on a small toy. Not actually unique, of course, because the Carlton version introduced that early doors. But you'd kind of expect that sort of approach in this age. Now, this does have the fold-up wings, pop out legs. The other one might pop out if I'm lucky, but it's decided not to. There we go. So again, exactly as you would expect. And then pod drops out. And as I say, empty pod, which is irritating because I've got every other Thunderbird 4 going, and yet somehow the Thunderbird 4 for this one is not around. I'm sure I'll find it a few days after having done this video, but but basically it'll be like that, only smaller. It's what it boils down to. Just a shining example that no matter what the era, Thunderbird 4 is always going to go lost at some point. But that is as far as Thunderbird 2s have gone to this point. I have no more Thunderbird 2s to show you because as of this point in time, obviously the 2015 series has not really stopped all that long ago. So actually, that remains the current iteration of the Thunderbirds and International Rescue. Long may they continue. And I say they will restart at some point. I mean, the only series I haven't covered here is Thunderbirds 2086, but that isn't really a Jerry Anderson show. That was an adapted anime show, and that did have its own set of Thunderbirds. And in fact, it had shed loads of Thunderbirds, and they were very futuristic, but I actually have no idea if any toys were ever created of them. So that might be my next mission. But I think I've probably spent enough for now trying to catch up on the ones to this point. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Thanks for watching. Do like and subscribe as ever. And that will help me to help you to see more toys of this sort of vintage. Cheers for now.